Welcome back to Sleepy Science History, my friend. I hope you're tucked in, cozy, and letting the day drift gently away. Tonight, we'll take a calming journey into one of the most extraordinary tales on Earth, the story of the plants that conquered our planet. Imagine barren rocks slowly turning green, mosses creeping forward, forests rising, flowers blooming, and life itself reshaping the world. It's a story not of battles, but of quiet persistence and gentle triumphs. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let this soothing adventure carry you, because once it begins, you'll want to hear it all. Welcome, my friend. May I ask you a question to begin with? Have you ever thought about what the Earth looked like before there were trees, before there were flowers, before even the simplest blades of grass brushed against the wind? It's almost impossible, isn't it, to picture a world without the greens we take for granted, without mosses clinging to rocks, without vines creeping up walls, without forests humming quietly with their ancient breath. And yet, if you could step back 500 million years, that is exactly the Earth you would find. A place of barren stone, empty plains, and lifeless mountains. Can you imagine standing on a cliff in that world, looking out at endless stretches of gray rock? Wouldn't it feel lonely, even a little unsettling, to see no shade, no shelter, no soft ground beneath your feet? I find myself wondering, what would it sound like in such a place? Would the wind whistle too harshly without leaves to soften it? Would the rain slap the bare rock with a kind of unkindness? And what of the air itself? Could we even breathe it, knowing there was far less oxygen then? Far less of that gentle, invisible gift that plants now provide for us every second? This was Earth once, a vast and silent stage, waiting for its actors. But then comes the mystery, and the miracle I love to ponder. How did life, delicate as it is, dare to step out of the water and attempt to claim this dry, unforgiving land? Have you ever tried leaving the comfort of a warm bath and stepping onto a cold bathroom tile? Your body shivers instantly, doesn't it? Now imagine doing that forever. The first plants, in a way, attempted just that, leaving behind the cushion of the oceans and trying to survive on the raw, hard surfaces of land. Why would they try such a risky thing? What whispered invitation did the rocks offer? The story begins, as all good stories of life seem to, in the water. Picture shallow pools, perhaps, or the edges of ancient seas. Tiny green algae swirled there, little more than clusters of cells basking in the sunlight. They had no roots, no stems, no leaves, but they did have one secret: chlorophyll. Have you ever thought of chlorophyll as a kind of magic paintbrush? With it, these small beings could catch sunlight and turn it into food, weaving energy into life. Isn't it astonishing that the same green pigment that now colors leaves in your backyard once colored these ancient ancestors, floating quietly in primeval seas? But then I ask myself, what happened next? How did some of those algae decide, if decision is the right word, to stretch themselves toward land? Did a few get stranded on damp rocks during low tide, clinging desperately until they discovered they could endure just a little longer out of water? Or did the land itself, full of minerals and untouched space, lure them into trying something new? It is a question we cannot answer fully, but doesn't the not knowing make it all the more wondrous? These early adventurers, which we might call moss-like pioneers, became the first true colonizers of land. Imagine them. Soft carpets spreading slowly across bare stone, catching drops of rain, trapping dust, holding on to tiny scraps of life. Do you know what they made possible? Soil. Yes, soil, that humble, dark cradle that cradles almost everything we eat and build with today. Before plants, there was no soil, only weathered rock. Can you picture the patience it took? Over millions of years, these plants broke down stone grain by grain, mixing it with their own decaying bodies, creating the first rich ground. Have you ever dug your hands into soil and felt how alive it seems? That miracle began with them. And then the air. Oh, the air must have changed so profoundly. Through photosynthesis, these little green colonizers released oxygen, slowly, invisibly. Breath by breath, puff by puff, they reshaped the sky itself. Don't you find it humbling that the air filling your lungs right now is a direct gift from generations of plants? Without their quiet labor, could any creature have ever stepped onto land? Could you and I be here having this conversation? Sometimes I think of these first moss-like plants as artists. With no rush, no hurry, they painted the world green, one stroke at a time. Isn't there something deeply poetic about that? That the most enduring transformation of Earth did not come with thunder or fire, but with tiny, silent organisms inching across stone. And yet, I wonder, did they know they were preparing the stage for others? Of course not in the way we understand knowing. But it feels almost like kindness, doesn't it? By making soil, by breathing out oxygen, they laid down the welcome mat for insects, for amphibians, for mammals, and eventually, for us. Have you ever felt grateful to something you cannot see, to a process so ancient you can only imagine it? That's how I feel when I think of these first plants. But let us not forget, this was no easy conquest. Have you ever left a potted plant unwatered for too long, only to see it droop in despair? Imagine what it meant for those early plants to live without the cushion of constant water. Drying out was a constant threat. To survive, they had to adapt. Some grew protective coatings to hold in moisture. Others developed ways to anchor themselves more firmly, to resist being washed away. Every tiny adaptation was a victory, a step closer to making land their own. Doesn't that sound familiar to you in some way? The way we humans adapt, sometimes painfully slowly, to new environments, new challenges. As I picture it, the earth began to soften. What once was gray and unyielding rock now bore patches of green. Mosses crept along riversides. Small plants clung to cliffs. And with each green patch came more life. Tiny microbes, then insects, then, eventually, the ancestors of amphibians crawling out from the seas. Can you see it in your mind? This slow blossoming, this transformation from emptiness to abundance? Sometimes, when I walk through a forest and feel the hush of moss under my shoes, I imagine I am stepping on living memory. Every cushion of green is a reminder of that first brave step plants made so long ago. Don't you think it's comforting to know that we walk daily across the work of billions of years? And so, I ask you again, have you ever thought of plants not as passive but as pioneers? As conquerors, even though in the gentlest sense of the word. They didn't march with weapons but with patience. They didn't destroy what was there before, but built upon it. Isn't that a conquest worth admiring? By the end of this chapter of Earth's story, the stage was no longer barren. The moss-like pioneers had done their work. Soil had formed. Oxygen filled the skies. The land was no longer a lifeless expanse, but a canvas ready for new players. Ferns would come, and trees, and flowers, each adding new notes to the song of life. But it all began here, with small green whispers clinging to stone. And here, I pause with a question for you. The next time you pass a patch of moss growing on a wall or a sidewalk, will you stop and look closely? Will you remember that what seems small and unimportant was once the very beginning of Earth's transformation? Sometimes the greatest revolutions are the quietest ones. So let us linger here at the dawn of green. Let us breathe slowly and imagine the patience of moss, the courage of algae, the gentle persistence of photosynthesis. Isn't it beautiful to think that the world you live in, every breath, every meal, every shade of green, was made possible because plants, once upon a time, dared to step onto land? May I ask you something curious? Have you ever looked at a fern, just a simple fern in a shady corner of a garden, and thought about how ancient it is? Not the particular plant you see, of course, but the kind of plant it represents. Its delicate fronds curl like question marks, unrolling slowly, as if time itself is hesitant to move forward. What if I told you that these shapes, these very patterns, are echoes of a world that existed hundreds of millions of years ago, when forests first came alive? Doesn't that make you want to lean in closer, to trace the fern's lace-like leaf and whisper a thank you? I sometimes wonder what the world felt like before the first forests rose. Do you think the silence of moss alone was enough? Or did the earth long for height, for pillars that would reach toward the sky? Moss carpets softened the land, yes, and they made soil, yes, but they remained close to the ground. Could insects find homes in moss alone? Could rivers be shaded without tall plants stretching overhead? Could the land be complete without the green scaffolding of forests? This is the question the next chapter of Plant Life answered. How to rise upward. Have you ever tried stacking blocks when you were a child, higher and higher, until the tower wobbled and collapsed? What made the difference between a weak tower and a strong one? The base, the structure, the material. Plants faced the same puzzle. To rise from low mats of moss into tall, vertical forms, they needed sturdier architecture. And here, evolution gifted them with something remarkable: vascular tissue. Does that sound too technical? Let's slow it down. Imagine a straw carrying water upward. Imagine a bundle of tiny straws, packed tightly together, not only lifting water but giving shape and strength to the whole structure. That, in essence, is what plants invented. Inside their bodies, tubes formed: xylem to carry water, phloem to carry food. The names don't matter much right now. What matters is the image. Thin moss became tall fern. Flat mats became rising stems. Suddenly, plants could stretch upward, supported from within. Isn't it marvelous how a tiny change at the cellular level could lift the entire green world toward the heavens? So I ask you, when you see a tree trunk or even a fern stalk, do you think of it as a bridge, as a straw, as a kind of hidden plumbing? Or do you see it as ambition, as the first great experiment in height? The earliest of these tall plants were not yet trees, not quite as we know them. They were more like enormous ferns and horsetails, rising meters above the ground. Can you picture that? An earth covered in green pillars, their fronds arching outward, catching sunlight in broad, feathery fans? And beneath them the world changed. Shade was born. Moist air lingered. Tiny animals found shelter. Soil grew deeper, enriched by the fall of leaves. Have you ever walked through a damp forest after rain, where the air clings cool and fragrant around you? Imagine that multiplied across the planet. The first forests wrapped the earth in a new kind of atmosphere: humid, lush, protective. Doesn't that sound like the beginning of comfort? But forests didn't just offer shelter. They built landscapes. Roots gripped the soil, preventing erosion. Rivers carved gentler paths, guided by the net of plant life around them. Oxygen levels soared even higher, perhaps higher than at any time since. Some scientists suggest that this oxygen-rich world allowed dragonflies the size of hawks to buzz through the air, their wings shimmering above fern canopies. Can you see it? Giant insects drifting like strange guardians in the twilight of primeval forests? Would you have dared to stand among them? Yet another question tugs at me. Why ferns? Why then? Why did life decide to make forests out of these particular shapes? Ferns do not flower. They do not make seeds. Instead, they scatter spores, tiny dust-like particles, across the air. Have you ever brushed a fern frond in late summer and seen the powdery dots underneath? Those are spore cases, tiny factories of reproduction. Doesn't it seem improbable that such dust could grow into a forest? And yet it did. Isn't it wonderful that something so fragile could reshape the world? If you've ever blown the fluff from a dandelion, watching the seeds drift away, you've witnessed a modern echo of that ancient gamble. Scatter widely, trust the wind, and hope a few land well. Isn't that a lesson we know in our own lives? Casting out efforts, words, dreams, not knowing which will take root? These fern forests also did something extraordinary, something we still live with today. They captured carbon. As plants photosynthesized, they pulled carbon dioxide from the air, locking it into their bodies. When they died, many of them fell into swamps and bogs, where their remains did not fully decay. Layer upon layer, over millions of years, those buried plants transformed into coal. Have you ever held a lump of coal in your hand? Black, solid, heavy? You were holding the compressed ghosts of forests more than 300 million years old. Isn't it eerie to think that the fuel that once powered trains and factories was born of fern fronds and horsetail stems? Sometimes I think of coal as a kind of time capsule, a message from those forests. Burn it, and you release their stored breath, their sunlight from ages past. But the earth whispers back, be careful, do not take too much, do not forget the balance. Do you ever feel that tension when you hear of climate change today, that we are too quickly spending the gifts of the past, forgetting the patience with which they were made? Let us wander again in imagination. You step into one of these first forests. The air is thick, warm, moist. Fern fronds arch over your head like cathedral ceilings. The ground is spongy with layers of fallen leaves. Insects hum. Some small, some enormous, wings beating in rhythms unfamiliar to modern ears. There are no birds yet, no mammals rustling, no flowers to brighten the green. But the atmosphere hums with growth, with expansion, with the confident rise of plants claiming the land. Would you feel peace there or unease? Would you be comforted by the green embrace or unsettled by its alien stillness? I admit I feel both. Ah yes, but also strangeness. These were forests, but not the kind we know. They were the first experiments in height and canopy, in shade and shelter. In a way, they were prototypes, trial runs for the forests that would later host dinosaurs, birds, and us. Doesn't that give you a sense of humility, to know that the forests we walk through today are only the latest chapter of a much older book? One of the most astonishing questions I find myself asking is this: did the plants intend it? Of course, plants have no minds, no goals in the way we understand them. And yet, their collective work changed the planet utterly. By making forests, they shifted the balance of gases in the sky. They cooled the earth, altered its weather, and even set the stage for ice ages to come. Can you imagine a species today, our own perhaps, changing the planet so completely, though not always with patience or balance? Doesn't it remind you of the responsibility we carry, inheriting such power? But let us return to wonder. Have you ever seen the spiral of a young fern frond as it unfurls, slow and deliberate? That shape, called a fiddlehead, is one of my favorite symbols in nature. It is a question mark, a promise, a gesture of becoming. It reminds me that forests, like all of life, begin curled in potential and then stretch outward. Isn't that what we do as well? Begin small, uncertain, wrap tight, then slowly uncurl into the world? The forests of ferns and horsetails may be gone now, replaced by later waves of trees and flowers. But ferns remain, humble survivors. You can still find them in shady gardens, in forest understories, even sprouting from cracks in city walls. Doesn't it amaze you that when you run your fingers along a fern today, you touch a living echo of those first great forests? That in their delicate fronds lies a memory older than mountains, older than animals on land? So here we are at the height of the fern age, when plants first mastered verticality, when the earth wore a new green crown. The air thickened with oxygen. The land grew fertile with soil. Swamps and forests spread across continents, laying down the coal beds we would later dig. Insects grew large, amphibians thrived, and the possibilities of life expanded outward. And I find myself asking you now, when you next walk under a canopy, whether it be oak or maple or pine, will you think back to those ferns? Will you imagine the silence of a world before flowers, before birdsong, where forests were fronds and stems alone? Will you feel, as I do, a quiet gratitude for their persistence, their gift of height, their invention of the forest? Because without them, could there ever have been redwoods? Could there ever have been rainforests? Could there ever have been the comfort of shade on a hot day, or the hush of leaves in a summer breeze? Perhaps not. So let us carry this image. Fern fronds rising, spores scattering like dust, roots gripping the earth, forests expanding until the planet itself wore a living cloak. The conquest of land was no longer a whisper of moss, but a chorus of green pillars. And in that chorus, the earth itself began to sing a new song. Can you hear it still, in the rustle of leaves around you? Do you ever stop to wonder what makes a forest feel complete? Is it the shade, the cool, damp air, the chorus of rustling leaves above you? Or is it something deeper? A sense that the trees themselves are not just standing there, but shaping the very land beneath your feet and the sky above your head? I sometimes think about the moment in Earth's history when plants truly became trees, when height was no longer just an experiment but a permanent way of life. Doesn't it seem inevitable now, looking at the towering giants we know today, that they would come to rule the land? And yet, the leap from fern to tree was not a simple one. We have seen moss lay the first carpets of green. We have seen ferns and horsetails rise into the earliest forests. But what happens when a plant decides, not consciously, but in its slow, persistent way, that it will not stop at a few meters or even 10. What happens when it tries to reach higher, and then higher still? Have you ever craned your neck to look at a skyscraper, feeling it pull your gaze upward until you almost lose your balance? Imagine that same awe in a world where the tallest things you'd ever seen were suddenly dwarfed by plants that seemed to touch the clouds. The answer, as with so much in nature, came down to structure. Ferns had stems strong enough for their modest height, but to rise like a tower, something more was needed. That something was wood. It's easy to take wood for granted now. It's in our furniture, our paper, even the walls around us. But there was a time when wood did not exist. When the very idea of a plant growing a solid, woody trunk was as new as the first winged creature learning to fly. Wood is made from a substance called lignin, and lignin is tough, astonishingly so. It's like the steel rebar inside a building's concrete, giving both strength and durability. Without lignin, a plant can be tall for a while, but it will bend, collapse, or decay quickly. With lignin, a plant can rise, stand firm, and live for centuries. Can you see the difference this would make? Suddenly, plants could support massive crowns of leaves high above the ground, where sunlight was abundant. They could branch out, casting deep shade. They could live long enough to dominate whole landscapes. And here's the fascinating part. Those first true trees didn't look exactly like the ones we know now. Have you ever seen a modern tree with no flowers, no pine cones, no obvious seeds? Just tall, strange fronds at the top? That's closer to what the earliest trees were like. Some, like Archaeopteris, had fern-like leaves but woody trunks. A strange and beautiful combination. They spread across continents during the Devonian period, forming the first dense, long-lived forests in history. Can you imagine stepping into one of those ancient woods? The trunks rise thick and straight, their bark rough and unfamiliar. Above, a ceiling of green filters the sunlight into shifting pools of gold and shadow. Beneath your feet, the forest floor is littered with fallen fronds and ancient roots. The air is still but alive with the sound of insects, some the size of your hand, others larger still. Would you feel safe there? Or would you keep glancing upward, half expecting some prehistoric shape to move among the branches? Trees didn't just change the view, they changed the earth itself. Their deep roots anchored the soil more firmly than ever before, preventing erosion on a scale no plant had managed before. Have you noticed how hard it is to pull out a sapling compared to a weed? Roots are the hidden muscles of the plant kingdom, and trees use them to reshape rivers, stabilize slopes, and hold entire landscapes together. Then there's the way trees began to cycle nutrients through the land. Every year, leaves fell in staggering numbers, decomposing into rich soil that fed new life. This constant layering of organic matter built deeper, more fertile earth than moss or ferns alone could manage. Can you picture the richness of that soil, dark, moist, smelling faintly sweet, alive with unseen creatures? And of course, there was the air. Trees, with their enormous canopies, became oxygen factories on a scale the planet had never seen. The atmosphere thickened with oxygen, inviting more complex animal life to thrive. If you could breathe that ancient air, would it feel different, cooler, sharper, somehow more potent? I think often of how this shift from fern forest to tree forest must have looked from above, if there had been anything in the sky to see it. Perhaps the green spread like a tide, covering valleys and hills, pushing up mountainsides. In time, whole continents wore vast blankets of forest. It's a strange thought. Before trees, there were places where you could see from one horizon to the other without obstruction. After trees, the view closed in, became more intimate, more enclosed. The earth began to hold secrets in its shaded places. But there was another change, one that shaped the path of life in ways both subtle and dramatic. Tall trees created layers in the environment. There was the canopy at the top, bathed in sunlight, the understory beneath dim and humid, and the forest floor often dark and cool. Each of these layers offered new habitats, new opportunities. Insects and amphibians adapted to these niches, and eventually so would reptiles, birds, and mammals. Without the architecture of trees, the complex tapestry of forest life we know today might never have existed. It makes me wonder, if you were a creature in those early forests, where would you live? Would you cling to the bright canopy, dancing among the fronds and basking in the sun? Would you skitter along the bark, halfway between worlds? Or would you stay low, moving quietly among the shadows, where predators might not see you? The rise of trees also set in motion an unplanned consequence, one that would echo through deep time. Like the great fern forests before them, these early woodlands captured vast amounts of carbon. Some of that carbon became locked away when trees fell and were buried before decomposing. Over millions of years, the removal of so much carbon dioxide cooled the planet, contributing to one of the first major ice ages in Earth's history. Isn't it remarkable and a little sobering that plants, simply by living and growing, could tip the balance of the entire global climate? And then there is the matter of reproduction. Trees did not yet have flowers, but they began experimenting with seeds, small, protected packages of life that could wait for the right conditions before sprouting. Seeds were an enormous leap forward. Have you ever held a seed in your hand and marveled that an entire tree could fit inside, folded and waiting? Early seeds weren't quite like modern ones, but they marked the beginning of a strategy that would eventually overtake spores as the dominant way plants spread themselves across the land. In thinking about all this, I sometimes feel a wave of gratitude, not just for the beauty of trees, but for their patience. A tree takes years to grow tall, decades to reach its full height. It invests in a future it will never see, dropping seeds that will only mature long after it is gone. Do you ever wish humans thought more like that, planting, building, and caring for things that will outlive us? By the late Devonian and into the Carboniferous period, tree-dominated landscapes covered much of the Earth's landmass. Rivers wound through shaded valleys. Swamps brimmed with life. The air buzzed with giant insects, and amphibians crept along muddy banks. The world had shifted, irrevocably, into something richer, more complex, more alive. When I think of those first great forests, I imagine them not just as places of growth, but as places of memory. Every ring in a tree trunk is a story, a season of rain or drought, of warmth or cold. Multiply that by millions of trees over millions of years, and you have a vast archive of Earth's history, written not in books, but in wood and leaf. So let me ask you, the next time you stand under a tree, will you think about the first ones? Will you imagine a time when their kind was new, when wood was an invention still finding its shape? Will you hear, in the creak of branches overhead, an echo of that ancient ambition to rise toward the sun? Because in that ambition lay the blueprint for the forests we know, for the homes of countless species, for the very atmosphere we breathe. The conquest of land was no longer a creeping carpet of moss or a graceful canopy of ferns. It was a realm of giants, rooted deep and reaching ever higher, remaking the world in wood. And perhaps, if you listen closely enough, you can still feel that reach in your own bones, that quiet, persistent urge to grow upward, to seek the light, to stand tall even in the face of time. Have you ever stopped to notice how a flower seems both delicate and powerful at the same time? A single bloom, fragile enough to wilt under a careless touch, and yet bold enough to catch your attention across a meadow. Doesn't it strike you as curious that something so small and fleeting could transform the course of life on Earth more profoundly than almost anything before it? I often wonder if we take flowers for granted. Those bursts of color in gardens, those quiet blossoms along the roadside, forgetting that they represent one of the greatest revolutions in the history of plants. Before flowers, the world was already green and vibrant. Mosses had paved the ground. Ferns had stretched upward. Trees had raised their woody pillars skyward and reshaped the very climate. But something was missing. Imagine, for a moment, a world without flowers. What colors would you see? Shades of green, yes. Browns of bark and soil. Perhaps the golden glow of sunlight on fronds. But the splashes of red, blue, pink, and violet that now seem natural would be absent. Can you picture such a palette rich in life, yet subdued, restrained, almost monochrome? And then, at some point around 130 million years ago, flowers appeared. Why then? Why not earlier? And why flowers at all? These are questions that still puzzle scientists, and perhaps that mystery only adds to their beauty. Flowers are not merely ornaments. They are intricate machines of attraction, bridges between plants and animals, invitations written in color and scent. Isn't that a wonderful thought? That every bloom you see is not just a decoration, but a message designed to be read by the eyes and noses of others? Have you ever leaned close to a blossom and inhaled its fragrance? Did you ever think of that scent as a kind of advertisement, a call to bees and butterflies? Come here, visit me, carry my pollen, and I will reward you? It makes me smile to imagine a flower as both artist and merchant, painting its petals while also conducting business. Before flowers, plants relied on wind and water to carry their spores or seeds. Functional, yes. Reliable, yes. But also wasteful. So much pollen scattered aimlessly. So many chances lost. Flowers brought precision. Instead of tossing possibilities to the wind, they enlisted allies. They said to insects, to birds, even to bats, "Help me, and I will feed you nectar sweet and irresistible." Isn't it clever? Doesn't it feel like a partnership rather than a gamble? Picture the first forests where flowers began to bloom. Amid the familiar greens, a splash of color appears. A curious insect, perhaps a beetle, lands and discovers nectar. The flower dusts its legs with pollen, and when it flies to another bloom, it carries the gift of reproduction. Slowly, across millions of years, this partnership deepened. Insects evolved to see colors more vividly, to taste nectar more precisely. Flowers, in turn, diversified, shaping their forms to fit the bodies of their pollinators. Some stretched long tubes to invite only butterflies and moths. Some offered broad landing pads for bees. Some opened at night to glow pale and fragrant for bats. Doesn't it seem almost like a dance, each partner adjusting their steps to match the other? And with flowers came fruit. Have you ever bitten into an apple, felt the sweetness flood your mouth, and thought, "This is not an accident"? Fruit is a strategy. It is a bribe. Plants wrap their seeds in delicious packages, tempting animals to eat them and carry the seeds far and wide. Isn't it funny that when you enjoy a peach or a berry, you are part of a plan millions of years old? You become a partner in dispersal, just as much as a bird dropping seeds from its perch or a squirrel forgetting where it buried a nut. The rise of flowering plants, angiosperms if you'd like the formal word, reshaped the earth in dazzling ways. Forests became more diverse, not only in structure but in color, scent, and texture. Grasslands spread, powered by fast-growing flowering plants that thrived in open spaces. Have you ever stood in a field of tall grasses, watching them bend and ripple like waves? That is a legacy of flowering plants, painting whole landscapes with movement and rhythm. Flowers also accelerated the diversification of animals. Insects exploded into countless forms, each adapted to pollinate or feed on blooms. Birds evolved brilliant plumage to match the blossoms they visited. Even mammals found niches among the flowers and fruits. Doesn't it amaze you how one innovation, the flower, could cascade outward, influencing the shape of ecosystems everywhere? Think, too, of time. Mosses had reigned for hundreds of millions of years. Ferns, too, had dominated long stretches of Earth's history. But once flowers appeared, they spread rapidly, outcompeting many older groups. Within a relatively short period, tens of millions of years, a blink in geological terms, flowers became the dominant plants on Earth. Today, about 90% of all plant species are flowering plants. 90%. Isn't it astonishing how a single adaptation could so thoroughly rewrite the story of life? When I look at a meadow in spring, buzzing with bees, alive with blossoms of every hue, I sometimes think of it as a symphony. Each flower is an instrument, some high and bright like flutes, some deep and velvety like cellos, some subtle, almost hidden, like a gentle drumbeat. And the pollinators are the dancers, moving from one to another, weaving the music into motion. Do you feel that, too, that nature is less like a machine and more like an orchestra, improvising endlessly on ancient themes? Yet I cannot help but ask, why beauty? Why color so rich? Why fragrance so sweet? Were they necessary? Or were they simply the most effective way to seduce animal allies? And if so, does that mean beauty itself is a kind of survival tool? The rose blooms not to delight us, but to call its pollinators. And yet, in doing so, it delights us anyway. Isn't it a curious thing that what began as strategy becomes, for us, art? And let us not forget how flowers have bound themselves to human life. We plant them in our gardens, give them as gifts, weave them into ceremonies of love and grief. We cultivate fruits and grains. Every meal we eat owes itself to flowering plants. Could we exist without them? Our bread, our rice, our corn, our apples, our coffee, all come from their generosity. Doesn't it make you wonder if we are, in fact, more dependent on flowers than we care to admit? I find myself thinking of one particular image. A bee diving into a blossom, legs dusted yellow, wings glinting in the sun. A moment so small, so ordinary, and yet carrying the weight of millions of years of partnership. Without such moments, day after day, season after season, would there be orchards? Would there be harvests? Would there even be us? So I ask you, the next time you see a flower, whether wild on a hillside or cultivated in a vase, will you pause? Will you consider that you are looking at one of Earth's greatest inventions, one that reshaped the air, the land, the very structure of life? Will you see not just petals, but a history of daring, of partnership, of quiet revolution? Because in the end, flowers conquered the earth not with force, but with attraction. They invited, they enticed, they formed alliances. They turned reproduction into a festival of color and scent. And in doing so, they wove themselves into the hearts of animals, ecosystems, and eventually, us. Perhaps that is their greatest lesson, that sometimes the most enduring power comes not from strength or persistence alone, but from beauty, from connection, from the willingness to share. And isn't that, in its own quiet way, the most human lesson of all? Have you ever walked barefoot through a meadow of tall grass, feeling the blades brush against your legs, listening to the soft hush they make as they sway in the wind? Did you ever stop to think that grass, so ordinary, so common, has shaped the very course of life on Earth more than almost any other group of plants? I sometimes wonder if the grasses know how powerful they are, standing there quietly, heads nodding, roots gripping deep, weaving themselves into the very history of animals and people alike. Doesn't it feel strange that something so unassuming has, in many ways, conquered the world more thoroughly than even the tallest trees? After flowers dazzled the world with their colors and scents, grasses arrived with a different kind of revolution, one not of spectacle, but of subtlety. At first glance, a grass plant hardly looks impressive. No showy petals, no sweet fragrance, no striking fruit, just slender blades, straight and modest. And yet, grasses rewrote the rules of ecosystems. How? Let's ask ourselves. What does it mean to cover the land completely, to spread in vast carpets, to endure both fire and grazing teeth? Isn't there a kind of quiet brilliance in that strategy? Consider their design. Each blade of grass is long and narrow, bending easily without breaking, catching the sun efficiently while resisting wind. Unlike most plants, grasses grow from the base of their leaves, not the tips. Have you ever mowed a lawn and noticed how quickly it bounces back? That's why cutting the top doesn't kill it. Grasses evolved this trait because they grew alongside hungry grazers who clipped them constantly. Instead of resisting, they leaned into the relationship. Eat me and I will grow again. Isn't that resilience at its finest? To be consumed and still return stronger, greener, ready to continue. And then there are the roots. Deep, fibrous, spreading roots that bind the soil like a net. Grasses don't just sit on the land. They hold it together. Prairies and savannas, steppes and pampas, all owe their stability to the underground architecture of grass. Without it, winds would strip the topsoil, rains would wash it away. Have you ever seen a hillside after grass has been cleared, bare dirt exposed, gullies carved by water? That is what happens when grass is absent. So, in their quiet way, grasses became engineers of landscapes, as much as rivers and glaciers. But perhaps the most astonishing part of the story is this. Grasses shaped animals, and animals shaped grasses, in an endless cycle of partnership and pressure. When grasses spread widely, herbivores adapted. Teeth grew stronger, flatter, better suited for grinding. Bodies grew larger, able to travel long distances across vast open plains. Think of the great herds. bison thundering across the American prairie, wildebeest sweeping through the African savanna, horses galloping free on the Eurasian steppe. Could any of them exist without grasses? And in turn, by grazing, trampling, and fertilizing, these animals help the grasses thrive. Isn't it amazing how two such different forms of life can become inseparable, bound in a dance of survival? Now, let me ask you, what do you eat in a day? Bread? Rice? Corn? Perhaps oatmeal in the morning, pasta at night. Each one is a gift of grass. Wheat, rice, maize, barley, oats, millet. Our greatest crops are all members of the grass family. At some point in human history, we stopped wandering after wild herds and began tending fields of grain. That was the birth of agriculture, of villages, of civilization itself. Isn't it humbling to realize that cities, cultures, and empires rose not from gold or stone, but from the seeds of grass? Imagine a small band of early humans, thousands of years ago, scattering grass seeds on the ground, watching them sprout, harvest after harvest. With steady food came permanence. With permanence came writing, art, trade, and all the things we call civilization. Could it be that the hum of traffic outside your window, the glow of electric lights above you, trace their origins back to a patch of wild grass tamed along a riverbank? Grasslands also changed the way life looked. Before them, much of the earth was cloaked in forests. But when climates shifted, when rainfall lessened and fires grew more frequent, grasses spread. They welcomed fire. Their roots survived underground, ready to sprout again even after flames swept through. Trees often could not, and so, forests retreated, replaced by wide-open plains. What does an open plain invite? Movement, speed, herds in motion, predators chasing. Have you ever watched a cheetah run? Or a horse at full gallop? Their bodies are shaped by grasslands, built for open space. Doesn't it astonish you that the swaying blades underfoot could sculpt the very legs of animals? And grasses did not just endure. They thrived. They colonized nearly every continent, from the frozen edges of tundra to the burning heat of savannas. Their flexibility is extraordinary. Some grasses grow tall as trees, like bamboo, towering over the forest floor. Others remain tiny, hugging close to the ground. Some spread by seed, some by runners, weaving themselves endlessly across the earth. When you look out across a lawn or a field, do you see monotony, or do you see resilience, a quiet empire stretching from horizon to horizon? I sometimes think of grass as the humblest conqueror. It does not demand attention like flowers, nor inspire awe like trees, but its influence is everywhere. It fills our stomachs, feeds our animals, stabilizes our soil, and softens our landscapes. Even in our homes, we mimic its presence. Lawns trimmed and watered, like tiny patches of prairie brought under human care. Do you ever ask yourself why we love lawns so much? Could it be that some ancient memory, carried in our species since the savannas, makes us long for open grass underfoot and wide skies above? And yet, grasses remind us too of fragility. Think of the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, when overplowing destroyed the deep roots of prairie grass. Winds carried the soil away in black clouds, choking farms and families. Isn't it telling that when grass is stripped from the land, balance collapses so quickly? We forget, sometimes, that our foundations rest on roots unseen. But let us wander back, in our minds, to the deep past. Picture the Miocene epoch some 20 million years ago. Vast stretches of grasslands dominate continents. Herds of antelope-like creatures graze endlessly. Early horses, small and swift, dart among them. Saber-toothed cats stalk in the tall grass, their movements hidden. The world is alive with motion, with rhythm, the rhythm of grass being eaten, regrowing, being eaten again. Can you hear it? The endless cycle, the quiet pulse of plains shaped by blades and teeth. And then, much later, humans join this cycle, not just as hunters, but as cultivators. We pluck grains, grind them into flour, bake bread. We gather rice in paddies, build societies around its abundance. We plant corn across continents, turning it into sustenance, into culture, even into myth. What is a loaf of bread? if not sunlight transformed into seed, transformed into life? Doesn't it make you feel small and grateful to think that every meal is a story of grass? Sometimes I catch myself looking at a single stalk of wheat in a field and imagining its ancestors. Wild grasses bending in the wind, unremarkable, unnoticed. Yet within them lay potential to feed billions, to build empires, to spark revolutions. Isn't it extraordinary that the fate of human history rested on something so small? And let us not forget the beauty of grasses, subtle though it may be. A golden field at sunset, each head of grain glowing like fire, a meadow alive with the shimmer of dew. Even a patch of bamboo, creaking gently in the breeze, creates music unlike anything else. If you stand quietly in such a place, do you feel it too, that sense of timelessness, of connection, of being part of something older and larger than yourself? So I ask you, will you look differently at grass now? Will you see not just a lawn to be trimmed or weeds to be pulled, but the great architects of landscapes, the builders of civilizations, the silent partners of animals and humans alike? Will you remember that grasses, in their modest way, are among the greatest conquerors the earth has ever known? Because in their quiet persistence, they reshaped continents. In their patient partnership, they fed creatures great and small. In their seeds, they carried the possibility of cities, cultures, and futures yet unimagined. And perhaps, when you walk barefoot through a meadow again, you will feel not just the tickle of blades against your skin, but the weight of history beneath your feet. A history written in roots, in seeds, in the endless, whispering breath of grass. Have you ever paused in a garden, maybe on a summer afternoon, and noticed a bee moving from flower to flower? Did you watch the way it buried its fuzzy body in the petals, collecting pollen, then lifted off again with a little hum, only to land on another bloom moments later? Have you ever thought about how ordinary that sight feels to us, and yet, how astonishing it truly is? Isn't it remarkable that a simple act of feeding could also be an act of partnership, an ancient pact written not in words but in color, scent, and sweetness? When I think about the story of plants conquering the earth, I can't help but linger on this partnership between plants and insects. It's one of the most elegant examples of coevolution we know. Plants, with their immobility, needed help spreading their genetic material. Insects, always searching for food, were perfect allies. But how do you convince another creature to become your delivery service? You don't shout, you don't chase, you entice. Flowers became invitations. Nectar became reward. Isn't there something beautifully gentle about that strategy? To win by attraction rather than force. Let us imagine the world before this alliance. Plants relied mostly on wind and water to move their pollen. Clouds of yellow dust drifting aimlessly, some grains finding their mark, most lost. It was effective enough, but hardly efficient. Do you know that even today, pine trees release enormous amounts of pollen into the air, a fine powder that coats cars and windows in spring? That is the old way, scatter wildly, hope for the best. But flowers found a shortcut. Invite a messenger. Doesn't it remind you of leaving a carefully addressed letter with a trusted courier, rather than tossing notes into the wind? So plants began to change. They evolved colors to catch the eyes of insects. They crafted scents to lure them closer. They offered nectar, a sweet liquid rich in energy, as payment. Have you ever smelled a flower so fragrant it seemed almost intoxicating? That is the language of invitation. To us, it feels like beauty. To insects, it feels like dinner. Isn't it marvelous that something designed for another species' senses can still delight our own? And insects changed, too. Some developed mouthparts to sip nectar more effectively. Others evolved bodies shaped to brush against pollen as they fed. Bees, especially, became extraordinary partners. They not only collect nectar but also gather pollen as food, carrying it on their legs in little golden baskets. And as they move from flower to flower, they cross-pollinate, ensuring the next generation of blooms. If you've ever watched a bee dusted with pollen, doesn't it look like a living brushstroke, painting the world with fertility? But it wasn't just bees. Butterflies joined the dance, fluttering from blossom to blossom, drawn by bright colors. Moths took the night shift, favoring pale, fragrant flowers that opened after dusk. Beetles, flies, even ants played roles in this vast pollination web. And in some cases, plants became so specialized that only one pollinator could serve them. Orchids are famous for this, some shaped to match a single insect's body, a lock-and-key system of astonishing precision. Doesn't it make you wonder how many secret partnerships are still unfolding unnoticed around us? The partnership grew so successful that it reshaped entire ecosystems. Grasslands, meadows, forests. Everywhere flowering plants spread, insects followed, and together they supported countless other species. Birds, mammals, reptiles, all benefited from the abundance of seeds, fruits, and nectar produced by this collaboration. Have you ever bitten into a strawberry or enjoyed a spoonful of honey and realized you were tasting the result of this ancient alliance? And let's not forget the ripple effects on evolution itself. As flowers diversified, insects diversified alongside them. A bloom with a long, narrow tube encouraged pollinators with longer tongues. A flower opening at night favored nocturnal visitors. This back-and-forth shaping of traits, each influencing the other, is what scientists call coevolution. But I like to think of it more poetically, as a conversation carried on for millions of years. One species says, "I will stretch longer." The other replies, "Then I will too." One offers sweetness at dusk. The other learns to fly in the twilight. Doesn't it feel almost like a duet? Two voices weaving together across time? If you've ever seen a hummingbird hover at a blossom, wings a blur, sipping nectar midair, you've seen one of the most graceful results of this long duet. Birds, too, entered the story. And bats, those unlikely night gardeners, pollinate countless plants in tropical regions. Can you imagine walking through a rainforest at night, hearing the flutter of wings, knowing that flowers were opening just then, releasing scents only bats could appreciate? Doesn't it feel magical that the world is alive with such hidden transactions, most of which we never see? Of course, this partnership was not without risk. Depend too much on a single pollinator, and a plant becomes vulnerable. If that insect declines, so too might the plant. Today, we see echoes of this fragility. The decline of bee populations threatens not just honey, but entire food systems built on pollination. It makes me wonder, are we listening closely enough to the whispers of flowers, reminding us of how interwoven life truly is? I sometimes imagine a meadow in spring as a great marketplace. Flowers open like stalls, displaying colors and scents. Insects buzz between them, bargaining, trading, carrying pollen as currency. There's no rush, no noise beyond the hum of wings and the rustle of petals. Yet, in this quiet market, the future of entire ecosystems is decided. Doesn't that make you smile, to think of bees and blossoms as merchants of survival? But there is also poetry here, deep poetry. The beauty of flowers, the hum of bees, the sweetness of nectar. These things resonate with us, too. We plant gardens not just for food, but for joy. We watch butterflies, not just as pollinators, but as symbols of transformation. We gift bouquets as tokens of love, never realizing that their colors and scents were designed for an insect's eyes and nose. And yet, somehow, they speak to us as well. Isn't it mysterious how strategies meant for survival become sources of human meaning and art? If you trace it back, you might say that much of what we call beauty in the natural world is really communication between plants and insects. The red of a rose, the fragrance of jasmine, the shimmer of a tulip field. These are not meant for us, and yet they move us deeply. Do you ever wonder if our sense of beauty was shaped, in part, by living so long alongside flowers and pollinators? Could it be that our hearts, too, are attuned to the colors of survival? And here lies another marvel. This ancient partnership feeds us still. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, all depend on pollinators. Our very diets are shaped by that exchange of nectar for pollen transfer. Without it, human life would be unimaginably poorer, not just in food, but in culture. Festivals, rituals, cuisines, all trace back to blossoms and wings. Isn't it staggering to realize that the hum of a bee in your garden connects to the survival of civilizations? So I ask you now, the next time you see a bee, Will you pause before brushing it away? Will you remember that it carries on its tiny body a story millions of years in the making? A story that binds plants, insects, animals, and humans together in an unbroken chain of nourishment and beauty? Will you see, in a butterfly's delicate dance, not just fragility but power, the power to keep a whole ecosystem blooming? Because in the grand saga of plants conquering the earth, flowers and insects wrote a chapter unlike any other. It was not conquest by force, nor even by quiet persistence. It was conquest by relationship, by sweetness and color, by turning survival into attraction. And perhaps, if you sit quietly in a garden some afternoon, you might hear the echo of that ancient duet still being sung. The buzz of wings, the sigh of petals, the endless invitation of life to life. Have you ever stood at the edge of a forest and felt it breathe? Perhaps you didn't notice at first. The quiet rhythm of the wind through branches, the coolness of the shaded air, the way the scent of soil and leaf wraps gently around you. But if you linger long enough, you begin to feel it. The forest is not just a collection of trees. It is an organism in itself, a living system that shapes the air, the land, the water, even the sky. Doesn't that make you wonder, when plants conquered the earth, did they stop at the ground beneath them? Or did they go further, reaching into the climate, sculpting rivers, stirring the clouds? I sometimes imagine Earth before forests matured. Yes, there were plants, tall ones even, stretching upward. But the world was still raw, its landscapes fragile. Soil eroded easily. Rainfall rushed away unchecked. Climates swung unpredictably. And then forests deepened. Roots grew stronger, binding hillsides. Canopies thickened, shading and cooling. Streams slowed, nourished by the steady drip of leaf litter. Wouldn't you agree that forests are more than scenery? They are architects, engineers, designers of the planet itself? Let's begin with something simple: water. Have you ever noticed how different a walk feels in the middle of a city compared to a walk beneath trees? The city air is dry, harsh, sometimes suffocating. In a forest, though, the air feels soft, damp, almost as if it holds you. That is no accident. Trees pull water from the ground, draw it up through their trunks, and release it gently through their leaves in a process called transpiration. Every leaf is like a tiny fountain, breathing out moisture. Multiply that by millions of leaves, and an entire forest becomes a cloud factory, sending vapor skyward to form rain. Doesn't that mean forests write their own weather? And what of rivers? Roots do more than anchor trees. They act like sponges, holding rainwater, releasing it slowly into streams. Without forests, rains would flood the land, rushing away in torrents. With forests, water lingers, trickling into rivers over time. Have you ever watched a stream in the woods? Its current gentle, its banks firm with roots? That steadiness is a gift of trees. In many parts of the world, when forests are cut, rivers become erratic, flooding in wet seasons, drying in droughts. Can you see now how forests do not just live with rivers but guide them? Soil, too, owes its richness to forests. Fallen leaves decompose into humus, a dark, fertile layer that feeds life. Insects churn it, fungi weave through it, roots stir it. The soil becomes more than dirt. It becomes a living memory of every season, every fallen branch, every raindrop filtered through moss. When you smell the earthy scent after rain, what people call petrichor, you are inhaling the voice of soil, born from the labor of forests. Have you ever pressed your fingers into forest earth and felt that softness, almost like cake crumbs? That texture is centuries of trees giving themselves back to the land. And then, of course, there is the air. We know that plants give us oxygen, but forests are masters of the exchange. By pulling in carbon dioxide and storing it in wood, they act as vast reservoirs, balancing the atmosphere. Some scientists call them carbon sinks. I prefer to think of them as accountants, keeping the Earth's books, ensuring the air remains breathable, the climate livable. Isn't it amazing that trees, quiet, rooted, motionless, hold such power over the sky above us? Forests also change temperature. On a hot day, have you noticed how stepping into shade feels like stepping into another world? The air cools, the glare softens, your body relaxes. Forests lower local temperatures not only with shade but by releasing water vapor, which cools the air. Entire regions are moderated by forests. The Amazon rainforest, for instance, is sometimes called the lungs of the earth. But it is also its heart, pumping moisture, stabilizing climate, influencing rainfall patterns across continents. Isn't it astonishing that what happens in one forest can ripple across the globe, shaping weather thousands of miles away? But let us return to something more intimate, the feeling of walking through a forest. Have you ever noticed the hush, the way sound seems softened? That is another subtle design. Trees absorb noise, leaves scatter echoes, trunks break up sound waves. A forest is not just visually calming, it literally creates quiet. Do you think that's why humans so often seek forests for reflection, for healing, for rest? Perhaps we are responding to something deep, something written in our biology, a recognition of the forest as home. Now, let us ask, how did plants learn to be architects on such a scale? Was it intentional? Of course not. Yet every adaptation, roots, wood, leaves, multiplied into planetary effects. Roots held soil, canopies intercepted rain, trunks locked away carbon. Over millions of years, forests created stable climates where animals could thrive, where ecosystems could bloom in layers. Canopy, understory, floor. Do you ever think of a forest as a cathedral, built not of stone but of living wood, each tree a pillar, each leaf a window? And like any cathedral, it shelters a congregation, not of humans, but of countless creatures. The first great forests, hundreds of millions of years ago, changed everything. They cooled the earth so dramatically that they may have triggered ice ages. They buried carbon so deeply that the coal we burn today is their compressed memory. Isn't it strange, and a little bittersweet, that we now release that ancient breath back into the air, altering the climate once again? What do you think the trees would say if they could speak about our haste to spend their patient savings? And yet, forests endure. Through fire, storm, drought, and ice they regrow. Even after logging, even after devastation, new shoots push upward. Isn't resilience one of their quiet lessons? That destruction is never the final word. That patience can outlast violence? Think of the ways forests have shaped human life. Where do we build our homes? Often near rivers, stabilized by roots. What do we breathe? Oxygen filtered by leaves. What do we write upon, build with, warm ourselves by? Wood from trunks that grew for decades, centuries. Even our stories are filled with forests. The enchanted woods of fairy tales, the sacred groves of myths, the dark forests of mystery and fear. Why do you think forests stir our imagination so deeply? Could it be that we carry, in our collective memory, the knowledge that forests have always shaped our fate? When you next step into a forest, perhaps you will look not only at the trees but at the spaces between them, the way light filters down, the way roots weave unseen, the way the air seems thicker, alive. Will you remember that you are standing in an architect's masterpiece, 1 millions of years in the making? Will you think of rivers and clouds, of soils and winds, all quietly guided by leaves and trunks? Because plants did not only conquer the land. In forests, they conquered the very systems of the planet. They became shapers of climate, sculptors of rivers, creators of breathable skies. They became not just inhabitants of Earth, but its caretakers. And perhaps, if we listen closely enough, they are asking us to remember that role ourselves, to care, to shelter, to hold the balance steady. Isn't it comforting and humbling to know that every time you take a breath, every time you drink clear water, every time you stand in cool shade, you are touching the gift of forests? And isn't it worth asking quietly, what gift will we return? Have you ever paused, standing in a forest or even beside a humble garden bed, and asked yourself, what is happening beneath my feet right now? We look up at the trees, admire their trunks, trace the flutter of leaves, smell the sweetness of blossoms. But how often do we stop to imagine the hidden world below the surface, where roots stretch like fingers into the dark and unseen companions weave their threads between them? Doesn't it make you wonder what secret conversations are taking place underground? For plants, the conquest of the earth was never something they achieved alone. From their very beginnings on land, they had silent partners, fungi. That may surprise you. Fungi, after all, are not plants. They belong to their own kingdom of life, closer in some ways to animals than to the green beings we're speaking of. But from the first tentative steps onto barren rock, fungi and plants work together. Have you ever heard the word mycorrhiza? It means fungus root. And that is exactly what it is. A partnership, intimate and ancient, between a plant's root and a fungus's thread-like filaments. Isn't it extraordinary to think that much of what plants accomplished on land was possible only because of this alliance? Let us imagine those first moss-like pioneers. Their roots or root-like structures were simple, fragile. Alone, they could not pull enough nutrients from the harsh ground. But fungi, with their thin, branching filaments, were masters of reaching into tiny cracks, dissolving minerals, bringing back phosphorus and nitrogen. So the fungi offered food, and in return, the plants gave sugar, the product of photosynthesis. A trade was struck, and from that trade, life flourished. Doesn't that sound familiar, almost human? A marketplace, an agreement, a handshake beneath the soil? Even today, most plants you see are engaged in this invisible exchange. A tree in a forest may have thousands of kilometers of fungal filaments woven through the soil around its roots, connecting it to other trees. Have you ever heard the phrase, the wood wide web? It's not just poetry. It is real. Through these fungal networks, plants can share resources, warn each other of pests, even send carbon and water where they are needed most. Imagine that trees speaking in sugars and signals, their voices carried by fungi. Doesn't that reframe what a forest is? Not just individuals standing side by side, but a community woven together beneath the soil. I sometimes picture it like this. Above ground, the forest is a crowd, each tree appearing separate. But below, it is a single woven fabric, threads of fungi binding roots into one body. Have you ever thought of yourself not as an individual, but as part of something larger, a network of unseen connections? Family, friends, community, history? Perhaps plants and fungi live with that truth more fully than we do. But how do we know such things are real? Scientists have traced radioactive carbon fed to one tree, only to find it appear later in a neighboring tree connected by fungal filaments. They've blocked fungi and seen the sharing stop. They've discovered that shaded seedlings, too small to photosynthesize much, can receive carbon from older trees through these networks. Doesn't that sound almost like kindness, like elder trees feeding their young? Or is it simply strategy, the forest ensuring its future? I like to believe it is both. And the fungi themselves, what do they gain? They cannot make their own food. They rely on the sugars from plants. So they stretch their threads outward, mining the soil, dissolving rock with acids, releasing locked-away minerals. In a way, fungi are alchemists, turning stone into nourishment. Can you picture it? Tiny filaments threading through cracks, whispering to roots, carrying gifts of phosphorus and nitrogen like little messengers? Isn't it magical that this happens every second, under every step you take outdoors? But the story is not only about nourishment. There are whispers, too, of information. When one plant is attacked by insects, chemicals travel into the fungal network, warning others nearby to bolster their defenses. Have you ever wondered how plants, rooted and silent, can seem so responsive, so aware of their environment? Perhaps it is because they are not alone, they are connected. Doesn't it make you wonder if a forest is less like a collection of trees and more like a single organism with many limbs? And yet, I find myself asking, do the trees know they are sharing? Does the fungus know it is a broker of information? Or is this simply what life does? Form connections, follow flows of energy, create networks wherever possible. Maybe we don't need intent for wonder to exist. Maybe the fact that it happens is marvel enough. Consider also how fungi shaped not just the soil, but the very possibility of plants colonizing land. Without fungal help, those early plants might never have survived on rock alone. Have you ever seen lichens on a cliff face? Those pale green or orange patches that look like stains. Lichens are partnerships too, fungi and algae living together, breaking down rock, making soil grain by grain. If you've ever brushed your fingers over lichen, you've touched one of the earliest strategies for turning stone into life. Isn't it humbling to realize that these quiet organisms prepared the stage long before we arrived? And what of us? Have you ever enjoyed bread, cheese, beer, wine? Fungi made those possible. Our relationship with fungi is as ancient and intimate as the plants. When you see a mushroom pushing through the forest floor, do you think of it as a solitary being? It is not. It is only the fruit, the visible tip of a vast network beneath the soil. The true fungus lives in the threads, the invisible architecture that plants rely upon. Doesn't that make mushrooms seem like whispers rising into view? Reminders of the hidden world below? Sometimes I like to imagine myself shrinking down to the size of a root hair, slipping into the soil. Around me, filaments glow faintly, like silver threads weaving in all directions. They twine around roots, fuse into their cells, stretch outward into the dark. Nutrients flow along them like rivers. Sugars pulse back in return. And here and there, signals flash, chemical words passing between plants. Doesn't it feel like entering an underground city, alive with commerce, communication, cooperation? But of course, not all is harmony. Some fungi take without giving, parasitizing plants. Some plants cheat, drawing nutrients but offering little sugar. It is not a perfect system, it is life with all its balances and betrayals. Yet overall, the partnership has endured for hundreds of millions of years. Doesn't that endurance speak to its strength? To the truth that cooperation, even messy cooperation, can outlast conflict? And think of the scale. The largest organism on Earth is not a whale, not a tree, but a fungus. A single network stretching miles beneath Oregon's forests. Isn't it almost unbelievable that under the soil lies a being so vast, so interconnected, it dwarfs anything above ground? Perhaps the conquest of Earth was not only green, but also white and silver, the color of fungal threads weaving through the dark. So I ask you, the next time you step into a forest, will you pause and think of what lies beneath? Will you picture not just roots but networks, not just soil but stories? Will you imagine trees whispering through fungi, passing sugars like gifts, sending warnings like messages, sustaining each other in ways we are only beginning to understand? Because the conquest of the earth by plants was never theirs alone. It was a duet, an alliance, a marriage of root and fungus. Together, they transformed stone into soil, barren ground into abundance, isolation into community. And perhaps, if we let ourselves listen closely, we might hear in that hidden partnership a lesson for our own lives, that we, too, are strongest not when we stand apart, but when we weave ourselves together in unseen but unbreakable networks. Isn't it a comforting thought that under every step you take, connections are already being made, silently, patiently, tirelessly? And isn't it humbling to know that the ground beneath us is not merely earth, but a living conversation millions of years in the making? Have you ever wondered how plants tell time? Not by clocks, of course, not by gears or ticking hands. And yet, they move in rhythm, in cycles, in patterns so precise that you and I rely on them without even thinking. Isn't it fascinating that while we stare at watches and calendars, plants have been measuring time for hundreds of millions of years? If you look closely, you can almost see it. The way a flower closes at dusk as if obeying some hidden bell. The way a tree sheds its leaves just before winter, right on cue year after year. The way seeds wait, sometimes for decades, for the perfect moment to sprout. Doesn't it make you wonder, what clocks are they listening to? Inside every plant, there is an inner rhythm, what scientists call a circadian clock. You and I have one too. That's why we get sleepy at night and alert in the morning, even without alarms. But plants, being rooted, cannot walk into the shade when the sun is harsh or move south when the frost comes. So their clocks are even more finely tuned. They must know when to bloom, when to rest, when to gather energy, when to let go. Isn't that a beautiful thought, that life itself is an orchestra conducted by the sun and the turning earth? Take the sunflower. Have you ever seen it track the sun across the sky? At dawn, it faces east, and through the day, it slowly turns westward, following the light. Then, during the night, it swings back east again, ready for morning. The plant is not watching the sun, not the way you and I do with eyes. It is obeying an inner sense of time, stretching its stem cells on one side, then the other, in a graceful daily dance. Doesn't that almost feel like a greeting, a bow to the day itself? But let's step back. Long before flowering plants or towering trees, the first green pioneers had to reckon with time in harsher ways. Seasons on a barren earth were brutal, scorching heat, freezing cold, dry spells that lasted ages. Imagine being a moss-like plant clinging to rock, needing to pause when the world turned hostile. Seeds had not yet evolved, but spores could linger, dormant, until rains returned. Doesn't it remind you of holding your breath until a storm passes? And then later seeds themselves appeared. Ah, seeds, little time capsules. Have you ever held one in your hand and thought of the patience locked inside? A seed can wait years, even centuries. There are date palm seeds, recovered from ancient ruins, that after 2,000 years still manage to sprout when given water and warmth. Isn't that astonishing? A life paused, as if asleep, waiting across millennia for its cue to awaken. Could you imagine falling asleep tonight and waking up in the year 4000, with no sense of the time in between? Plants do that. Seeds carry within them not just food and instructions, but trust in the rhythm of the earth. And what of trees, those great keepers of time? Each year they lay down a ring within their trunks, narrow when seasons are hard, wide when rains are generous. If you've ever seen a cross-section of a tree, you've seen a diary of years, written in wood. Some trees, like the bristlecone pines, keep their journals for thousands of years. They have witnessed ice ages, droughts, storms, empires rising and falling, all while standing rooted in one place. Doesn't that humble you, to think that a tree might live longer than entire civilizations? But plants don't only keep time for themselves. They are also the great metronomes of ecosystems. When a tree blooms, it signals bees to wake and gather. When grasses seed, birds know to feast. When leaves drop, the soil is nourished for microbes and worms. Isn't it incredible that the timing of one life echoes outward, guiding countless others? Without plants keeping the beat, the symphony of life would fall apart. Now, you might wonder, how do they do it? How does a plant know when it is spring or winter, day or night? The secret lies in light. Inside their cells, plants have pigments that sense day length, a phenomenon called photoperiodism. For example, some plants are long day bloomers. They flower when days are longer than nights. Others are short day, waiting for the long nights of autumn. Have you noticed how chrysanthemums bloom in fall, while irises prefer spring? It is their inner clocks reading the language of light. Doesn't that seem like magic? That light itself is a kind of whisper, telling plants what season has arrived? Even temperature plays its part. Some seeds will not sprout unless they feel the chill of winter first, a process called stratification. It's as if the seed is cautious. I will not risk growing until I am sure the cold has passed. Can you blame them? Survival depends on patience. And patience, I think, is a kind of wisdom plants embody better than we do. Have you ever thought about hibernation, not of bears or frogs, but of trees? In winter, deciduous trees withdraw, slowing their sap, shedding their leaves, sleeping until the world is kind again. They do not resist the cold, they flow with it. Isn't that a lesson we often forget? That there is strength not only in striving but also in resting. And then there are the astonishing extremes. In deserts, seeds can lie hidden in dry soil for decades, waiting for a rare rainstorm. When it comes, they burst into bloom almost overnight, carpeting the barren land in flowers. Have you ever seen pictures of the Atacama Desert after rain? It looks like a miracle, purple and yellow blossoms across a place usually thought lifeless. But it is not a miracle. It is timing. It is plants keeping their secret clocks, waiting patiently for their moment. Doesn't that sound like hope embodied in biology? Time for plants is not only days and seasons, it is also epochs. Ferns rose in the Carboniferous, dominating forests for millions of years. Later came the gymnosperms with their naked seeds, then flowering plants, which changed the earth forever. Each era had its champions, its patient dominators. And yet each knew when to yield, when to adapt, when to pass the baton. Doesn't that mirror history itself, waves of civilizations, each flourishing, then giving way to the next? I sometimes think plants may know time more deeply than we ever could. We measure hours and minutes, but they measure continuity. We rush through days, but they stretch across centuries. Have you ever leaned against an old tree and felt that it was almost listening, patient in its slowness, unbothered by your hurried heartbeat? Perhaps that is what draws us to plants when we seek calm. They remind us of longer rhythms, steadier pulses. And yet, despite their patience, plants are never passive. They anticipate, they prepare. Buds form before spring, seeds scatter before winter, roots stretch before droughts. Their sense of time is not just reactive but proactive, as if they are always one step ahead of the weather. Doesn't that remind you of wisdom, quiet foresight, not frantic motion? Even in our lives, we rely on plant time without noticing. The foods we eat arrive in seasons: strawberries in summer, pumpkins in autumn, citrus in winter. The rhythms of agriculture, festivals, even traditions all tie back to plant cycles. Harvest celebrations, spring rituals, winter feasts, they are human reflections of plant time. Isn't it curious that we often forget the source, as though we invented calendars, when in truth plants wrote the first one? And then there is the great irony. Plants seem still, rooted, unchanging. But in truth, they are dancers with time, swaying to its music more faithfully than any creature that moves. We hurry past, thinking they are silent, but perhaps it is only that their rhythm is slower than ours, too deep for impatient eyes. Doesn't that invite us to slow ourselves, to notice, to align? So I ask you, the next time you see a flower closing at dusk, will you think of it as mere habit, or will you see it as a clock hand moving, precise and ancient? When you pass a tree in winter, bare and quiet, will you imagine its inner patience, its trust in spring's return? When you bite into a fruit, will you taste not only sweetness, but timing, the perfect meeting of sunlight, water, and patience? Because plants have not only conquered the earth, they have mastered time. They have taught us, if we are willing to listen, that life is not about resisting cycles, but moving with them. Isn't that, in the end, a kind of peace? Have you ever stood in a garden and wondered why flowers exist at all? Why do plants go to such extraordinary lengths, producing colors as dazzling as rubies, fragrances as sweet as honey, shapes as intricate as lace, when they might simply spread their kind quietly, without all the spectacle? Isn't it curious that in a world once filled with only green and brown, a sudden riot of blossoms appeared, changing not just the face of the earth, but the fate of life itself? Let's drift back in time, far before the first rose bloomed or the first sunflower lifted its head. Imagine walking, though in truth you'd need to wade, through a vast forest of ferns and towering conifers. The air is heavy, damp, filled with spores drifting like invisible dust. Plants reproduce here, yes, but without flowers. Their strategy is ancient. Release pollen or spores into the wind, scatter them widely, hope a few meet their mark. It works, but it is clumsy, wasteful, and limited. Don't you feel the awkwardness of that? Like mailing thousands of letters and praying one lands in the right mailbox. And then, something remarkable happened. Around 140 million years ago, plants invented flowers. Not just a new organ, but an entirely new way of interacting with the world. Can you sense the daring in that moment? To stop throwing messages blindly into the wind and instead invite collaborators, bees, beetles, birds, bats, into a partnership so intimate that the very shape of life would be transformed. Doesn't it strike you as almost romantic, this alliance between plant and pollinator? A flower, at its heart, is a lure. Its petals are like neon signs. Come here, sweetness awaits. This fragrance is a whisper carried on the air. Its nectar is a bribe, a payment for services rendered. And what is the service? To carry pollen from one blossom to another, to connect lives across distance, to ensure reproduction with precision. Isn't it astonishing that plants, rooted, silent, without eyes or wings, learn to outsource their love letters to the animal kingdom? But let us pause for a moment and ask, Why all the variety? Why so many shapes and shades? Why the orchid's delicate lip, the sunflower's bold disc, the rose's layered spiral? Could it be that each flower is tuned to its chosen partner? The trumpet-shaped bloom fits the hummingbird's beak. The wide daisy welcomes bees. The pale night-blooming jasmine opens only for moths. Doesn't it feel like a dance? Each step matched, each gesture mirrored? And what about color? You and I see petals as red, yellow, blue. But bees see differently, perceiving ultraviolet patterns invisible to us. To them, flowers are painted with hidden road signs, guiding stripes, glowing centers that shout, "Here, nectar this way." Isn't it delightful to imagine that a daisy is more colorful in bee vision than in ours, adorned with secret signals we will never see? Consider also the perfumes. To us, they are pleasant, sometimes overwhelming. To insects, they are maps, invitations, or even deceptions. Some orchids smell like female bees, tricking males into landing and carrying pollen. Isn't that mischievous, almost playful, the plant using perfume as disguise? But flowers are not only seductions. They are also revolutions. Their invention triggered an explosion of diversity, what Darwin himself called the abominable mystery. Why, he wondered, did flowering plants spread so suddenly and so widely? Perhaps it was their efficiency. By enlisting pollinators, they reproduced faster, colonized quicker, adapted more nimbly. Within tens of millions of years, they became dominant, carpeting the earth in blossoms. Doesn't it feel like the world, once hushed in green, suddenly burst into song? And this floral revolution did not only change plants. It changed animals too. Insects evolved alongside flowers, their tongues lengthening, their senses sharpening. Birds adapted beaks. Bats stretched wings for night flights. Mammals discovered the sweetness of fruit. Isn't it fascinating that your morning apple, your afternoon coffee, even the chocolate you savor, these are all gifts of that ancient pact between flower and pollinator? Speaking of fruit, shall we wander there for a moment? For what is a fruit but a flower's after-story? Its fulfillment, its gift to the future. Once pollinated, petals wither, and ovaries swell into apples, berries, nuts, grains. A strategy even more ingenious. Entice animals not only to visit, but to carry seeds away, wrapped in sweetness. Don't you marvel that every bite you take is part of a contract written long ago? You eat, I travel? I sometimes imagine the earth before flowers and after. Before, a quieter, simpler palette, spores drifting, winds carrying invisible burdens. After, meadows alive with color, insects buzzing from bloom to bloom, perfumes weaving through air, fruits swelling on branches. Isn't it like comparing a whisper to a symphony? And yet, flowers also carry time within them. Some open only for a single day, the morning glory, bright at dawn, wilted by dusk. Others linger for weeks. Some bloom in spring, others wait until autumn. Each species has its rhythm, its window, its trust that pollinators will arrive when needed. Doesn't that remind you of patience? That not everything must hurry, that beauty can arrive exactly when it is meant to? But let me ask you something more personal. Have you ever given or received flowers? Perhaps on a birthday, a celebration, or even in grief. Why do you think humans carry this habit, this ancient echo of blossoms? Could it be that flowers, with their transience, remind us of the fleeting beauty of life? Or perhaps their colors and scents touch something in us we cannot put into words? Isn't it curious that plants, in creating tools for their survival, also created symbols for ours of love, of sorrow, of hope? And think of agriculture. The wheat fields, the rice paddies, the maize rows. All are grasses, flowering plants whose blossoms are modest, but whose seeds feed civilizations. Without flowers, there is no grain. Without grain, no bread. Without bread, no cities. Doesn't it amaze you that our very history is rooted in petals we seldom notice? Even now, as we sit here, flowers are at work. A bee hums across a meadow, dusted in pollen. A hummingbird hovers, its wings a blur, sipping nectar. A fruit begins to swell, unseen, promising sweetness weeks from now. The dance continues, unbroken for millions of years. Doesn't it make you feel both small and privileged to witness even a moment of it? Of course, not all flowers play fair. Some deceive without reward, offering no nectar, only empty promises. Others trap insects temporarily to ensure pollen transfer. Some open at night, aligning with bats and moths, leaving the day to others. Isn't it striking that in this great symphony of color and scent, there are tricksters, thieves, and clever strategists too? But perhaps that is the essence of life. Not perfection, but diversity. Flowers remind us that beauty and cunning, generosity and trickery, patience and urgency, all coexist. And from that coexistence, entire ecosystems bloom. So let me ask you again. When you next pass a flower, will you see only decoration? Or will you sense the ancient story unfolding in its petals? Will you notice the hidden ultraviolet signs, the perfumes crafted for noses not your own, the quiet pact between blossom and bee? Will you remember that your fruit, your bread, your very breath, these are threads spun from blossoms long ago? Because flowers are not merely ornaments. They are storytellers, matchmakers, inventors, revolutionaries. They conquered the earth not with force, but with allure. And in their conquest, they reshaped not only landscapes, but destinies. Isn't it beautiful to think that the world we live in, the colors we see, the foods we eat, the festivals we celebrate, is all, in some way, a gift of flowers? And perhaps, if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it now. A meadow humming, blossoms swaying, pollinators dancing. The earth, once barren, now dressed in petals. A story still unfolding, petal by petal, season by season. Do you ever wonder how a single plant, standing quietly in a patch of soil, can ripple out and change an entire world around it? How something so still, so rooted, can end up weaving networks of life that stretch far beyond its leaves? Isn't it curious that plants, these unassuming green beings, don't just grow, they create worlds? Let's think about this for a moment. Imagine a vast meadow filled with grasses, each blade rising to catch the sun. Alone, one blade doesn't do much. But together, an entire field creates shade, cools the soil, shelters insects, and softens the wind. Isn't it astonishing that by simply existing, plants alter the very rules of the game? They build ecosystems not with hammers and nails, but with sunlight and patience. And what exactly is an ecosystem? At its heart, it's a community. Plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, rocks, water, and air, woven together in countless exchanges. But here's the thing. Without plants, none of it holds. Would rivers flow the same without forests to guide them? Would air taste the same without leaves to breathe it into freshness? Would animals thrive without seeds and fruits to sustain them? Isn't it safe to say that plants are not just participants, but architects of every living stage? Think of a forest. Doesn't it feel like a cathedral when you walk beneath tall trees, their branches arching overhead? Yet this cathedral is not built of stone, but of wood and light. The canopy spreads, offering shelter. Beneath it, shrubs and ferns thrive in dappled shade. Mosses cling to stones, mushrooms rise in the damp. Birds nest in branches, insects hum in the undergrowth, mammals wander pathways between roots. All of this, every flutter, every rustle, depends on the steady work of plants. Doesn't it remind you of a host preparing a banquet, making space for every guest? And it isn't just forests. Consider wetlands, where reeds filter water and lilies float in quiet ponds. Without plants, marshes would collapse, water would stagnate, fish and frogs would vanish. Or deserts, where cactus and hardy shrubs provide the only green in a sea of sand, food, shade, and water reservoirs for lizards, birds, and even humans. Can you see how plants hold the fragile balance, even in harsh places? But perhaps the most magical role of plants is soil making. Have you ever picked up a handful of soil and felt the crumbly richness slip through your fingers? That didn't appear overnight. It's the gift of roots breaking rock, leaves falling, microbes thriving, organic matter building over centuries. Without plants, earth would be bare stone. Doesn't it amaze you that the very ground beneath your feet is, in many ways, the work of countless generations of green. And then there's water. Do you realize how deeply plants guide the flow of it? Forests draw rain clouds, their leaves releasing vapor that drifts upward, becoming weather itself. Roots hold soil, preventing floods. Trees along rivers shade fish, their fallen leaves feeding aquatic life. Isn't it extraordinary that water, this restless wanderer, finds its rhythms shaped by beings that cannot move? Let's not forget oxygen. Every breath you and I take, every lungful of life, is a direct gift from plants. Leaves are quiet chemists, pulling carbon dioxide from the air, mixing it with sunlight, exhaling oxygen in return. Isn't it humbling to think that the air filling your chest right now was, quite possibly, exhaled by a tree or a blade of grass? And yet, what fascinates me most is the relationships plants create. Picture a flowering meadow. Bees sip nectar, birds swoop for insects, rabbits nibble grasses, foxes chase rabbits. All these exchanges trace back to plants, don't they? The plant feeds the insect feeds the bird keeps balance by feeding on insects or small mammals. Doesn't it feel like a carefully tuned orchestra, where every note depends on the green chords beneath it? Have you noticed, too, that plants never take more than they need? A tree stretches upward, yes, but it does not strip the sky. A flower calls to pollinators, but it does not hoard every bee. Grass spreads across fields, but leaves space for wildflowers. What if humans behaved more like that, living fully but leaving room for others? Isn't it a question worth pondering? And how about the hidden partnerships? Roots tangle with fungi underground, trading sugars for minerals in a silent handshake. Nitrogen-fixing plants house bacteria in nodules, enriching soil for neighbors. Trees of different species even share nutrients through fungal networks, what some call the wood wide web. Doesn't it delight you to know that beneath our feet, plants are whispering to one another, sharing, cooperating, and balancing in ways we are only just beginning to understand? Now, let me ask you, have you ever felt comfort sitting beneath a tree or walking in a park? Why do you think that is? Could it be that plants, through their quiet generosity, shape not only ecosystems but our inner landscapes too? Studies show greenery lowers stress, sharpens minds, heals bodies. But long before studies, humans simply knew. We planted gardens, tended fields, wove myths around sacred groves. Don't you feel there's a wisdom there, that plants have always been more than background, more than scenery? And what about the great migrations of animals? Herds of wildebeest following the rains to green pastures, monarch butterflies tracing flowers across continents, birds journeying between hemispheres guided by the promise of food. Who sets the stage for these epic travels? Always plants. Doesn't it strike you that the migrations we marvel at are, in truth, pilgrimages to green? But ecosystems are not static. Forests burn, deserts shift, wetlands dry and flood again. Yet plants return, seeding, sprouting, reclaiming. After a volcano, mosses arrive first, stitching soil onto lava. After fires, wildflowers bloom in defiance, coaxing insects and birds back. Doesn't it give you hope that resilience is written into the very fabric of green life? Now pause with me here. What is your favorite ecosystem? A forest trail, a mountain meadow, a quiet garden? Can you see in your mind's eye how plants shape it? Without them, would the animals be there? Would the sounds, the scents, the moods remain? Isn't it clear that plants are not just part of ecosystems, they are the stage, the script, and often the actors too? Sometimes, I think of plants as the earth's breath and bones. Without them, rivers would wander unanchored, air would grow stale, soils would erode, animals would scatter. With them, everything knits together into patterns of abundance. Isn't it remarkable that by simply staying in one place, plants hold everything else in motion? And yet, here's the quiet paradox. Though they give us everything, food, air, shelter, beauty, we often overlook them. We notice the tiger but not the grass that feeds the deer it hunts. We admire the eagle but forget the tree cradling its nest. Do you see how easy it is to miss the green foundation beneath the drama of life? And once you notice, doesn't it shift how you see the world? Perhaps that is the true lesson. Plants conquered the earth not by domination, but by weaving networks, by connecting, by sustaining. They turned barren stone into living webs. They built ecosystems not for themselves alone, but for countless others. And in doing so, they gave us a home. So let me leave you with a question. The next time you step outside, will you see plants as background or as architects, hosts, and world makers? Will you hear the quiet hum of ecosystems built leaf by leaf, root by root? And if you do, won't the world feel richer, fuller, more alive than ever before? Have you ever wondered what it means to say that plants conquered the earth? Does conquest sound too fierce, too warlike for beings that sway gently in the breeze, rooted to their spot? Or could it be that their kind of conquest is softer, slower, and far more enduring than any empire humans have ever built? When we say plants conquered the earth, aren't we really saying that they learned how to endure, to adapt, and to shape the future, not only for themselves but for every other form of life that followed? And what of us, humans? Where do we stand in this great green story? Do we see ourselves as separate, builders of cities, shapers of landscapes, inventors of machines? Or do we recognize that every wall we raise, every tool we craft, every breath we take is tied to the quiet work of plants? Could it be that the truest measure of our future lies not in concrete and steel, but in how we tend to the green foundation beneath us? Think about the food you eat today. A slice of bread, perhaps, or a fresh piece of fruit. Do you notice how, behind every bite, stands a plant? Wheat waving in golden fields, apple trees blooming in spring orchards, rice paddies shimmering with reflected sky. Even meat and dairy, when you trace them back, begin with plants, don't they? Cows graze grass, chickens peck at seeds, fish nibble algae. Without plants, what would there be to sustain us? Isn't it astonishing that our entire food web is rooted in green? But it isn't just food, is it? Think of your clothing. Cotton shirts spun from fluffy bowls, linen woven from flax, even synthetic fibers tracing back to fossil fuels. Ancient plants transformed beneath the earth. Or medicine. Aspirin from willow bark, digitalis from foxglove, countless compounds waiting in roots, stems, and leaves. How many of the remedies that save lives come directly from plants' chemical creativity? And how many more secrets are hidden in forests, yet undiscovered? Doesn't it make you feel both grateful and curious, as though nature were a library we've barely begun to read? And what about shelter? Look around you. The wood in your home, the paper on your desk, even the oxygen in your lungs as you sit in that room. All gifts of plants. If you were to peel back the layers of your daily life, wouldn't you find leaves and roots behind every convenience? And if so, doesn't that suggest that plants are not just our background, but our constant companions, the quiet co-authors of human history? Yet here's the question that tugs at me most. If plants have given us so much, how well have we given back? Have we learned their lesson of balance, of creating abundance while leaving space for others? Or have we sometimes taken without listening, expanded without pausing, consumed without gratitude? When forests fall and soils erode, when air thickens and waters dry, isn't it really the unraveling of the green fabric that sustains us? And if plants could speak, what might they ask us? Would they plead for care? Or would they simply keep on growing, trusting that one day we might remember the partnership we've always shared? But perhaps the more interesting question is, what can we learn now? Plants have endured ice ages, droughts, floods, volcanic winters. They've survived asteroid impacts and shifting continents. How? Not by speed or force, but by patience, diversity, and adaptability. Could we, too, survive better if we followed their ways? Imagine if our societies mirrored a forest, different species, each with their role interwoven into a resilient whole. Wouldn't our world be steadier, less fragile, if we grew like ecosystems instead of building like empires? And here's another wonder. Plants don't just endure change, they guide it. Consider climate. Forests pull carbon from the air, cooling the planet. Grasslands lock carbon in their roots, steadying soils. Wetlands soak up floods, buffer storms, cleanse waters. When we talk of battling climate change, aren't we really talking about aligning ourselves again with the work plants have been doing all along? Isn't the solution, in many ways, as simple and profound as letting plants grow? I often ask myself, what would the earth look like without us? If cities crumbled and machines silenced, who would remain? Plants, without doubt. Vines would creep across stone, moss would blanket ruins, trees would reclaim streets. In a few centuries, the world would green again. Doesn't that reveal a certain humility? That our monuments may fade, but leaves will always rise. Roots will always dig, seeds will always scatter. And perhaps the real question is, can we choose to live in harmony with that green resilience instead of against it? But harmony is not only ecological, it is personal. Have you noticed how plants calm us? A walk through a garden, a glimpse of green out a window, even a potted fern on a desk. It eases something inside us, doesn't it? Scientists call it biophilia, the love of living things. But isn't it simpler to say that our bodies remember? Deep down, we know we belong in green company. And perhaps that is why, in times of stress, so many of us turn to parks, forests, and gardens. Plants remind us not only how to live, but how to be. So let me ask you directly, what is your own relationship with plants? Do you grow herbs on a windowsill, walk under trees on your way to work, breathe in the fragrance of a flower? Do you pause to notice the small green presences that steady your days? And what might shift in your life if you did? Could noticing a sprout pushing through pavement remind you of resilience? Could the patience of a tree teach you to slow down? Could the generosity of a plant, offering oxygen, food, beauty, teach you to give more freely? And beyond the personal, what about the collective? What would our communities look like if we centered plants in our designs? Greener cities, cooler streets, cleaner air, healthier people. Isn't it striking that so many solutions, urban gardens, reforestation, regenerative farming, are really just invitations to let plants do what they've always done? And if we embraced that, might we find that the green conquest of Earth is not in the past, but ongoing, with us as participants rather than outsiders? Here's a final thought to ponder. When we say plants conquered the Earth, we don't mean they crushed or defeated others. Their conquest was one of generosity, of transformation. They turned barren rock into soil, empty skies into oxygen-rich air, lifeless landscapes into thriving webs. And in doing so, they made space for us. Isn't it time, then, that we honor their victory not with exploitation, but with stewardship? So, as this long journey through green history comes to a close, I leave you with one last question. Tomorrow, when you see a tree or a flower or a patch of grass, will you look past it? Or will you see the conquerors, the architects, the ancient teachers who built the very stage of life? And if you see them truly, won't your world feel just a little brighter, a little more wondrous, a little more alive? And so, dear listener, our gentle journey comes to rest. From mossy stones to flowering fields, from ancient ferns to towering forests, the plants have shown us how patience can move mountains and how quiet persistence can reshape a world. The air we breathe, the food we eat, the beauty that surrounds us, all trace back to their steady green hands. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you'll carry with you this thought, that life's greatest victories are often the softest ones. Rest well, and let the whisper of leaves remind you, you are part of this timeless story too.